And the other thing I had to worry about, almost every farmer I talked to had either dropped into one of these in the winter through a spring or knew if somebody had done that. And sure enough, I went into early March. It got up to about 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Here I go, I dropped through. And luckily, about a foot down was a layer of salt, and that's what I was able to drive on. That was the end of that project. So one thing that I did see was the waterfowl in late fall would get caught where they'd land in these lakes. Temperature would be dropping probably even a half degree, enough that they would get coated with salt. This Ross goose, I ended up picking him up. I tried to chip the ice or the salt off him, and got him to Bismarck, called the zoo, and I said, hey, can you take this guy and try to nurse him back to health? They said, well, we're worried that he could be diseased and he could kill the rest of the waterfowl, the birds at the zoo. And they said, oh, by the way, do you know how many federal waterfowl regulations you just violated? So I did turn that over to a friend that worked with who had a farm. He nursed it for several days and it died. I think it had just ingested. In fact, right before I took the picture, it was pecking, trying to get that salt off. I think he just ingested too much of it. Okay, landslides. If you notice, I try to get something for everybody here. So landslides, we're pretty proud of this. We just recently completed mapping all the landslides in North Dakota. I think we're the first state to do that at a scale of 1 to 24,000, over 62,000 landslides. We started with just looking at the old USDA photographs, which in North Dakota are flown 57 to 63, 65. Unfortunately, flown leaves on, which is not what we wanted. Then we went to, that was phase 1. Phase 2, we used LiDAR, which was a real godsend, and also Google Earth. And now we're into phase 3, where we're comparing LiDAR coverages. So the first LiDAR flown in North Dakota was 2008, then flown again in the east in 2018. So we compare those elevations. And so in pink are the landslides from the phase 1, phase 2. The darker pink are what we picked up in the LiDAR coverages, which we had to do a lot of filtering to get that, a lot of noise. We had to take care of a lot of man-made things that caused elevation changes. Up in the right-hand corner there, you see the Bourbonnais Dam. So not only, so there's, within this 20 square mile area, there's 5 earthen dams. And you can see many of them are anchored in landslide material. These are pure shales, these are Cretaceous shales. But most importantly, for the Bourbonnais Dam, you can see that there is movement right above that, right above the dam itself. So we turned this over to Bureau of Rec and to our State Water Commission. But this is amazing to me what you can do. So again, that $1,500 drone, we bought $5,000 worth of software. We're able to grid that, and you can set it so it stays 200 feet above the surface. And so this is 150 photographs that we stitched together, again using software. And I'll just flip through here. Makes for some nice pictures, but more importantly, you can then create a surface elevation map based on that. We compared that to the LiDAR from 2016, and then we were able to calculate the 3,500 cubic yards of rock from the Cannonball Formation, which is very susceptible to landslides. Either the mudstone slides on the sandstone or the sandstone slides on the mudstone. But we then turned that information over to the Burley County engineer. Okay, critical mineral projects. I want to talk about this because we've spent a lot of time, I think we probably have the oldest critical mineral project in the country. We've been going continuously since 2015, measured 306 sections, which maybe doesn't mean a lot, but the average thickness of those sections is 125 feet. That's 7.2 miles, almost straight up for all these sections. And 2,200 samples, which about 2 pounds per sample, so several tons that we've carried in backpack for a mile or more. 1,700 of those samples have been analyzed for the 50 critical minerals, which Rare earths is what we focused on, which are 17 of those. It's the lanthanide series with yttrium and scandium, and then the other criticals, cobalt, gallium, germanium, and such. So, which has just been in the news that the Chinese now are talking about cutting us off of gallium and germanium. Luckily, we've got a fair amount of germanium in some of these North Dakota coals, and you might see higher numbers in subbituminous or anthracite, but it's much harder to get those out. The nice thing with this soft coal is that we've seen that the organic complexes in those that are holding these critical minerals are pretty loose. So it's easier, you can use weaker acids to separate those. Stratigraphic column for western North Dakota, you can see the bar over there is the number of samples. So you can see the rain bed and bear den member, those are both paleosols. And we'll get to that for a second. So of our samples, the U.S. Department of Energy has said 300 parts per million is probably economic in coal. The work that's been done up at University of North Dakota, they think that number is much lower. But we've stayed with the 300, so everything on that plot diagram, everything in green would be economic based on that. We started at 169 parts per million in 2015 was the highest number reported for North Dakota coal. We've pushed that up to 2,800. And we've been able to do that largely based on these two paleosols. So this one is 56 million years old. It's the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum when temperatures throughout the world raise very quickly. We had a lot of acidic water being pushed through the soil profile. I think you would call that ultrasol maybe. But you can see the iron rich, and then we've got iron pans running through that. And then typical North Dakota coal, rare earth concentrations probably run around 50 to 75 to 100. You can see the numbers jumping up to 1,500 and 1,900. Same thing here, another location where here, in this case it jumped up to 800 parts per million. When you look at a composite we put together and took all of those, the white rock, label it as a bear den, that's that paleosol, and you can see that the rare earths are really concentrated along that. They've been leached out from some of the rocks above and then concentrated in there. We don't see, with the other criticals, we don't see as great a profile as that. We see multiple profiles. Klachenko and others did great work on this. They were able to get some quantitative work on the difference between smectite and kaolinite. You can see the increase over on the left side. Compare it again to where we're seeing increases in the rare earth concentrations. So now we drop down about 1,000 feet stratigraphically and down to about 61 million years ago. This is not a worldwide or well-known weathering profile, but it certainly is good here in North Dakota and eastern Montana. You can see we don't see the iron staining in this paleosol like we do the one above it, but you can certainly follow that line. This is Little Missouri River, and we're looking to the east, Bullion Butte. In the distance, Logging Camp Ranch is then just over the horizon. Sometimes this bed shows up very well at dusk. And here's our sample where we got the highest reading so far at 2,800. Here there's a silcrete, a silicious rich unit. Typically that's at the top of these bleached profiles. Here it's at the middle. The same with the bear den. In fact, it's called the Taylor bed here in North Dakota, but that silcrete's almost always at the very top. So you can see that small map, index map in the lower right for southwestern North Dakota. The areas in brown of the bear den, in kind of an orangish brown, and darker brown is the rain bed extending across. Just quickly, we're working in areas of uraniferous or radioactive lignites that were mined back in the late 50s and 60s. And so we would always carry a scintillometer with us, which is big and bulky. Now they make these little pocket ones, which work out really well. It's reading 166 counts per minute, and typically 60 to 80 is background in coals in western North Dakota. Rattlesnakes, I'm always amazed. We work around those. Anyone that's done that, anyone in Montana, South Dakota knows that bull snakes are much more aggressive than a rattlesnake is. But I'm always amazed how they blend into the surrounding rocks. Scorpions, we're out there with scorpions, which is why sometimes we wear gloves, because you pull a piece of coal out and a scorpion will be hanging on the bottom side of it. Ranchers that have been out there 4 generations have no idea because they're not digging in those coals, which is where they live, and then they come out in the evening. Just a series of pictures. The one in the upper left, we were wearing masks long before anyone else. September 2017 was really nasty for smoke. Now everybody's having problems with smoke from Canada. It's nice being the oldest guy in the group because the young guys are the ones that have to go out and see if the river's too deep or too muddy for us to cross. And again, working in a lot of beautiful areas. How am I doing for time? I'll just jump one other. Okay, good. Okay, if you look out the window here, you've got the Bismarck Railroad Bridge. It was completed in 1882, and it's going to be replaced. It was built by Northern Pacific. What's interesting is the bridge supervisor came out from New York City, and the river was migrating across this area. It was way too wide, so he just threw a dike in there. I used to talk to the state engineer who said, oh my God, you know how many permits you'd have to get today to try to put a dike across something. But one of the interesting things with the Bismarck Railroad Bridge is that they use caissons. And caissons, of course, had been used famously in the Brooklyn Bridge, as well as the Eads Bridge in St. Louis. But this was still relatively new technology. So we're looking west. The East Pier is right on the lower right-hand corner. And then the second pier, Pier 2, is, you can see some activity there. They're actually laying the granite stones on there. But there are men in caissons probably at that point about 20 feet below the ground level. And you can see there's a pipe extending out where I've got that red arrow, and you can see the sand being pumped out. And then the third caisson is kind of in the mist in the background. So this is a picture of, it's attributed to the Bismarck Bridge, to the caisson, but the dates are wrong, and it's off by a year, but this would still be the same technology. So they use these thick planks and then bolted them together with wrought iron. And then they had an airlock to get the men in and out. Here you've got a dozen men working. 2 of them are bent down. They're sucking the sand off the bottom. And as they would do that, then the caisson would settle, and of course you had multiple tons of granite above you for those granite blocks. One of the biggest fears, of course, was drowning. If the pressure got away from you, that water filled up, only probably 1 or 2 people could have got up the airlock in time. But people are often surprised the next greatest fear was fire, because those planks were all lined with pitch, which were very flammable. And these guys were down there with lanterns and torches. And in fact, if this is the second caisson, it did start on fire, and everyone had to get out through the airlock, and then they flooded the caisson and then went back down in. People were pretty expendable back then, as an example. So what happened, and again, it's amazing to me, with all this, they also had a false ceiling above they filled with concrete. So they had all this weight, but there were times that the air pressure got too high in the caisson and it wouldn't settle. This actually happened a fair amount. So they'd have to pull everyone out, and then they'd bleed the pressure off. And it was dangerous because if the pressure got away from you, again, that would just suddenly flood. But after a few days of this, they decided they just bleed it off with the men in there. So that's why I say they were expendable. That was pretty dangerous work. The other thing was the bends. Caisson disease, as they talked about the Brooklyn Bridge, or the bends. So you imagine how high that pressure was when multiple tons of the bridge pier above you would not settle. But there's no record of how many people might have died from the bends, because it wasn't well understood. Here's Pier 2 completed. Here's the testing of the bridge. So they sent 8 locomotives, and you see if the locomotives from the 1880s, they're like little toys. I mean, it looks like you could literally pick them up. So it's amazing that this bridge, they changed the spans in 1906 because, again, the locomotives have got that much bigger. But it's amazing that the piers are still sitting there over 140 years later. Over on the far side, there's a huge line of carriages and people watching this test. But to me, what's really interesting is you can see a crack that goes up that hillside. And when you look at 1919, I showed arrows to what looks to me like a scarp for a landslide. Immediately after the bridge was completed, that east pier started moving towards the river. And it moved a distance of 8 or 9 feet, which the bridge would have failed except it moved parallel to the tracks. So just a quick story to wrap up. In 1991 or 2, I got a call from a fellow, Jack Millard, out of Regina, Saskatchewan, saying, can you tell me the propensity of landslides in marine versus non-marine rocks? Because he said, I'm working with a fellow and we're trying to come up with an answer to that. So I said, well, I'll run out and map 3 quadrangles in non-marine rocks and 3 quadrangles in marine. And he said, well, that's great. So I sent him the information. And then he called me back and he said, you know, my partner and I were so thrilled with what you did. I'm wondering if we could do something for you. And he said, my partner is Ralph Peck. Well, Ralph Peck is probably the most famous civil engineer in the world, taught at University of Illinois, and had a book that I tried to read as a young kid, one of my dad's books, Soil Mechanics, Terzaghi and Peck. So Peck sends me all of his notes because he worked on the Bismarck Railroad Bridge in 1951, trying to stabilize that east pier as well as to change the alignment of the tracks because the locomotives had gotten so big that they could no longer negotiate the curve going into that track. So it was an opportunity to interact with a real hero of mine, and so I thought, oh, I'm glad I did that guy a favor. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions if there's any time.
Yeah, speaking of heroes, thank you for coming, Ed. Any quick questions for Ed here? Comments?
Thank you for the presentation. Just a quick point of question or comment. If I'm not mistaken, leading back to Lewis and Clark, if I'm not mistaken, their first encounter with a grizzly bear was right here, roughly? Yep. Okay.
Yeah, the Barren Ground Grizzlies, and the famous quote was, and I don't remember, I think it was Clark, could have been Lewis, who said, because they mentioned them, and after a while they said their interest and excitement for them had waned. They were no longer, and of course they ran into them again in Great Falls. But interesting of that, on top of one of these, as we were doing this critical mineral project on top of one of these buttes, again the rocks are millions of years old, but came to the edge of what would have been a den, and there were bison bones in there. And so we were trying to figure out, was that a grizzly bear den that had hauled down some bison? And so we're having those analyzed to see if they can find scratch marks, and we've sent them in for carbon dating. But yeah, there's certainly been times I thought that would be kind of interesting to run into a grizzly, and other times not. I did run into a grizzly in Glacier Park. It's a long story, but we went in September of 1986, September 9th, and they warned us, hey, the weather's changing. We got up on top of Stony Indian Pass. We were 18 miles out. And I've got a picture of a couple clouds coming together at sunset, woke up to 12 inches of snow. We had to walk all the way out. And towards the end, we were getting hypothermia. We knew we had to get out of there. And in fact, we stopped to camp. Everything was wet. We couldn't get a fire going. And so we ran into a huge, right in the middle of the trail, ran into a huge pile of blueberry dung. And around it were big grizzly bear prints and then small prints for a cub. As we kept walking because it was getting dark, and we were coming to Bell River Ranger Station, if you know that area on the northeast side, got into a series of switchbacks when we heard a bark. It sounded just like a dog barking. And we waited again, it was getting dark, and we finally went up the trail, and you could see where the mother and the cub turned off. And the next morning I asked a ranger, I said, you know, it sounded like a dog. I don't think a dog would have been out there. And he said, that's the warning. The mother gives you that bark, and that's the warning before they charge. So I said, oh, thank you, God. So.
Thank you, Ed. Thanks so much.
So, Jingyi, you ready?
Yes.
So folks, as you wind up, we're going to continue on with the afternoon session, and our first speaker for the afternoon session is Dr. Jingyi Hang from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who's going to talk about his work with sensors. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to see everybody here. And today I'm going to show some of the current work and project we have been working on, developing some new technologies for soil mapping and potentially facilitate soil surveys and other applications. So I would love to hear feedbacks from people from the NRCS and universities and other agencies to see how some of the work can be potentially relevant for the research you are currently doing. So I would like to acknowledge people from my group and also my collaborators from the university and also from some of the USDA agencies. So basically, soil scientists focus on the soil physics and soil sensing technologies. So I would like to start with this diagram. So basically, that highlight the importance of soil in these ecosystems. So as we study these ecosystem services, so we know that soil is you can place soil in the center of this interface. So especially when we talk about climate change and disturbance resilience, so we know that soil process and properties that have essential roles in this process related to the water cycles. Water is important for food production and food security. Also, soil mitigates climate change, so by controlling or regulating these greenhouse gas emissions, carbon sequestration. So that will also have implications for climate change mitigation. And then last but not least, so we have this nutrient input and output in the soil. So if you want to better manage the soil, you better collect more information related to soil properties, but also related to this process. So with that, so I would like to present some of the current technology we'll be developing, trying to capture these three broader processes related to the water, carbon, and nutrients. So we know that there is an urgent need for this soil information, but more likely, we want to frame this in an affordable or scalable way. So we have this point data that have been sensed by the sensors like the SCAN, USDA, NRCS networks. So this provides you high-frequency data for a few locations across the US. And then this data can be used to benchmark some models. But we're also interested in this aerial-based information. For example, this proximal sensing of myself and doing this survey in a cornfield. Then with this EMI. Also, we trying to start or harvest the satellite data that provides you more high spatial temporal frequency data that capture the area you want to generate some information. So when we talk about these dynamic soil properties, we know that a lot of these can be indirectly or directly sensed from these sensors from the in situ, proximal, and remote sensing platforms. So how can we relate some of these technologies to map and sense and monitor some of these properties or processes? So the first stuff is trying to highlight the importance of soil moisture in this drought mitigation. So I think most people are familiar with some of the drought indexes, but they are mostly proposed by climate scientists. They are mostly related to the meteorologic drought indexes. They use precipitation, evapotranspiration data. And recently, because people are putting more investment in these satellite-based soil moisture products, so we're trying to get more sense of this drought from the agriculture perspectives. So when we talk about agriculture drought, we can use some soil moisture information that is sensed by satellite data like SMAP. So the work we're trying to emphasize here is if you try to use soil moisture information as an index for the drought, so you get a better forecasting performance for when you talk about this GPP or gross primary production across different ecosystems, including cropland, but also this natural system like forest. The other obvious difference you can see is from this figure. So if you look into these climate drought indices, like this precipitation or ET-based indices, there is no drought in the southeast or like Florida, but we know that there's a lot of sandy soils. A lot of time, a lot of moisture are not available to the soil, to the plants. So we do identify some soil drought-related products using the soil moisture. So this is a current project we've been working on. So this is the early version. We're trying to use this digital soil mapping framework to get these high-resolution soil moisture products for the US, continental US. So there's an open R package we have been developing, so it's available on GitHub. So any of you are comfortable using R, so feel free to download this. So basically, if you input a polygon with a study area anywhere in the continental US, so you can get these downscale daily soil moisture products for the 0 to 1 meter depth and 100 resolution. So then, based on that, we're trying to evaluate this product at different locations and to see if this high-resolution downscale soil moisture product can actually provide any information for management. So we pick up a site in Washington State, so in the Columbia Basin. So we know that if you take a look at this information from the existing SMAP products, the finest one you can get is 1 kilometer or 3 kilometer resolution. So you're going to have an underestimation of soil moisture because most of the pixels are masked by the grassland. There's no irrigation activity happening. But actually, the landowners are putting a lot of water through irrigation. So then our product is going to pick up these signals from these fine resolution inputs of the satellite data. So we did see differences of these soil moisture signals from the rainfall as compared to the irrigated and also grassland. So we have been updating this product to a 2.0 version as an ongoing project with the USDA NIFA. So what we're trying to do is we're also trying to bring more mechanics modeling with a soil water balance model and to run these data simulation tools, and to get these products have better performance in different regions of the US. So if any of you feel like there's a potential way we can use these products for any research you are currently working on, feel free to contact me so we can basically run some models quickly and as pilot studies in the areas you're interested. And the other thing I'm talking about is the second part, the soil and relating to the climate change is carbon cycles. So basically what we've been doing is we're using these NEON National Ecological Observation soil plots data managed by the NRCS and analyzed by the Lincoln Lab. So we're trying to use this space for time algorithms to find this reference point, as Sky mentioned earlier. So then if you find this reference point, then for certain soil order, so for the same soil order, we find a reference point, then we compare the change of soil carbon stocks as compared to this soil-specific reference point. So we can calculate this difference of this soil carbon change as controlling different ecoclimate regimes of the US, but also as controlled by this management and land use change. So what are the general conclusion we get from this data set? So all these comparisons, pairwise comparisons, are done at these NEON sites. So it's not distributed across the whole U.S. Statistically. But then we did say a lot of the hotspot, or sometimes you call it cold spots, of this carbon stock change along through the profiles. So for example, in the eastern part of the U.S., we did see some of the soil organic carbon accumulations by this comparison. So these are purely empirical based. We assume there can be the translocation or sometimes leaching of the carbon, especially in these humid regions. Then somehow in these Great Plains or in the central US, based on this ecological survey data, we do not see a huge increase of carbon. Instead, we see a big loss of soil carbon stocks. We don't have any management data. All these sites are the long-term ER site. So if any of you have this data, so we can have a better representation for this spatial explicit carbon stock change. Then we also notice that for some part, for this molly soil or this heavily cultivated soils, we do have, say, a big carbon loss based on this comparison. And the other thing is we are also trying to relate this soil to these ecological responses or functions, because nowadays people have these high hyperspectral cameras flying across the canopy. They give you this highly dimensional data set that can be used to map the plant traits. For example, you can map the chemical composition of the leaves and infer how climate change affects these ecosystem functions. So we've been working with this, trying to see how soil types and the differences of the soil controls this resilience of these ecosystems when you have this climate gradient. So we're also trying to harvest this mid-infrared spectroscopy to get some key estimation of these keystone soil microbial properties, for example, the carbon fractions, also carbon use efficiencies. So I think my colleague, Dr. Zhang, is going to talk about this in the poster later, how we can use this MIR to better understand some soil microbial properties. And the other thing I want to mention is I know a lot of people are trying to study this time-consuming but really valuable data set about this gas emission. So in our lab, we developed some distributed sensor networks. It's like sometimes you go to this off-the-shelf sensor from Amazon, you can find a few bucks, you can get a few sensors. So we're trying to use this idea to say develop some low-cost gas emission chambers to get this greenhouse gas emission measurement. So we know that the quality of this data may not as good as this GasMat or LICOR you have in the field. But the good thing is the trade-off is we have tons of these gas chambers. So each gas chamber, we have these gas sensors. Either we get them from the off-the-shelf sensor, or we custom design it or manufacture those sensors. So those are the 4 stations. You are going to say we have 4 gas chambers laid down in the ground in Wisconsin, basically close to Christmas. So that's why we have a lot of snow on the ground. But some of the sensors did work well and provide you data even in a cold environment. So we want to do this more in a distributed way. So if you have one eddy current flux tower, or if one gas chambers, we can pair one of these with like 6 or 10 of these. So this way you can do replicates, you can test hypotheses for different treatment. So we are trying to test this feasibility of this and to get more sense of how field scale, local scale variability of soil, physical, chemical properties affects this gas emission. Lastly is something really interesting about these nutrient cycles. So as you can see on the left, you have a map for this USGS nitrate data in the groundwater. So in Wisconsin, we have a heavy dairy industry. So we do feel like there's a priority trying to reduce this nitrate contamination in these regions. So then, but we know that most of the time when you want to do nitrate contamination measurement, you do this monitoring, you need to use this disruptive sampling, so which will not give you a lot of high dimensional data, high frequency data. So that's why we're also trying to build some of these low-cost sensors. It's like when you have this push probe, as some of may have used for moisture sensor, we put our nitrate sensor at different location of this push probe. Then you install them to the soil. Then this sensor will give you real-time, close to real-time nitrate estimation in the or monitoring in the soil conditions. Then we combine this data with other data like soil moisture and temperature. We can close this nitrogen cycle with the help of some biogeochemists or other process-based modeling. So those are also another tool we're developing on, testing in different regions. So with that, I would like to conclude. So if any of you are interested in this sensor technology we have been developing on, feel free to come talk to me this afternoon or even tomorrow. So we would love to test our technologies and to answer some questions that are related to your research. Thank you.
We have some time for questions for Dr. Huang. 1 minute. 1 minute for questions. Mark?
I was interested in your gas sensors. What are those? You said you got them from Amazon or something like that?
So one of them, we get them from the other fruits, as some of the sensor companies. So it's like $70 for the CO2 sensor. So from a company called Other Fruits. But for the N2O and ammonia, we are developing them ourselves. For those are based on oxidation of some iron oxide electrodes.
What about for methane? Anything?
So we haven't been working on that, but if there's a need, we can look into that in the future.
Well, surely there's a need if you can get it for $70.
Well, but for that, we won't find them from off the shelf. So only the CO2 we can find them from off the shelf. The rest we need to build them.
Okay. I think that'll be it for questions. Thanks very much. Our next speaker is Dr. Rasmussen this afternoon, who's going to be talking about wildfire impacts. So there you go.
All right, thanks. Wait for the slides to come up here. There we go. All right, so I first want to point out this is a collaborative team, and the work supported Christian Barra, who's a master's student working on the project now, and Miles Poulet, who's a forest ecologist, worked on the project. And Don Falk is a forest ecologist in the School of Natural Resources, and his project was really kicked off by Luke McGuire and Ann Uberg, who are geomorphologists really interested in modeling post-fire debris flow initiation in response to rainfall intensity. And so they kind of dragged soil scientists and forest ecologists along with them, and this is kind of the beginning of this work. This work's funded by the cooperative agreement with the NRCS, as well as a small grant from the University of Arizona Institute for Resilience. I think that's their name. It changes about every 2 years, I think. As well as Pima County, the Regional Flood Control District. They're really interested in these data in terms of understanding debris flow and flood risk hazards in Tucson, which is at the base of the Catalina Mountains. All right, so a number of objectives, basically looking at coupling ecological site concepts in these forested systems with post-fire wildfire, post-fire response in terms of soil hydraulic properties, soil nutrient status, and seedling establishment and vegetation return. And a bunch of wordy hypotheses, but these figures probably show it better, focusing on the soil hydraulic properties, is that we really expect to see this shift over time in things like hydrophobicity and with a similar change, an inverse change in saturated hydraulic conductivity as these systems recover from that post-fire environment. And so the work, it's taking place in, it's tough to see from this map, I guess, in southeastern Arizona, southwestern New Mexico, and taking advantage of what are called Sky Islands forest systems in these areas. They're called Sky Islands. Essentially, we have these mountain ranges jutting up from the desert system. So the desert in this case would be the sea, and the mountains are the islands of forested systems that are critical for habitat for migratory birds, watershed and groundwater recharge in the basins, as well as an escape valve for recreation. In June, when it's 105, you can go up to the top of the mountains and it's 80 degrees. So you get that local relief valve. So the mountains that we are ranges that we are sampled include the Santa Catalina Mountains. Here is SCM, which are just outside of Tucson. The Rincon Mountains, as well as the Pinaleño Mountains, just outside of Safford, and another location in the Apache, or the Gila National Forest up in the Tularosa Mountains. And these sites were selected, they're locations where the geomorphologists have worked previously, and we're able to get out almost immediately post-fire, and then we're going back and resampling these sites at different time periods. And so that allows us to build this time sequence of recovery across these mountain ranges over several decades. From the Catalinas, which I'll focus on in this talk, which burned most recently in 2020, all the way to the Rincon Mountains, where those sites have not burned significantly for about 25 to 30 years. So the ecosystems that we're focused on and most interested in include the Madrean pine oak, so it's kind of a pine oak woodland. It's the northernmost extent of that. It's much more prominent as you move south into Mexico in the heart of the Sonoran Desert. Ponderosa pine dominated systems as well as mixed conifer systems. And these are the best ecological site descriptions that I could find and edit to match the sites that we're looking at. And then again, we're sampling across different time sense fire across these different ERUs, or ecological response units in Forest Service terminology. Okay, so as I mentioned, the data I'm going to present today is just going to be one slice of the data that we have collected so far, and it's going to focus on the Santa Catalina Mountains, which are there just outside of Tucson. These are easy to get to. You can be from the University of Arizona campus up to 9,000 feet in about an hour. And so we can get up and down, and it's ease of access and accessibility. We were able to get out immediately post-fire and sample a small subset of sites in 2020, and then have done repeat sampling since then. And we focus this sampling usually in June before the summer monsoon starts. So we get the end of the dry season before the rainfalls begin. To give an idea of the physiography of these ranges, again, kind of typical what we call Sky Island ranges, where as you move up in elevation, you grade from kind of Sonoran Desert scrub, hot, dry desert systems, up to mixed conifer at the high elevation. And we're focusing in particular on these pine oak, ponderosa pine, and mixed conifer systems. So in the Catalinas, the parent material is predominantly this tertiary aged granite. And the mean annual temperatures then, they go from, well, what's now probably closer to about average of about 21 degrees Celsius up to about 8 degrees C at the top of the mountains. And the precipitation increases from about 35 centimeters per year to just about a meter at the top of the mountain ranges. And that snowfall, that precipitation we have a distinct bimodal distribution. We get winter frontal systems coming in off the Pacific, where at the high elevation largely falls as snow. And then we get summer monsoon systems. And the distribution, it's about 50-50 or 40-60 winter and summer rainfall. So that summer monsoon plays a big role in terms of water supply and productivity. The soil moisture, temperature regimes, you go in the systems we're interested in, you're grading from mesic and ustic up to, and if you're sitting on a north slope at the highest elevations and you look at the soil moisture and temperature data, you're on the verge of frigid and eutic in terms of soil moisture and temperature regimes. That bimodal distribution of rainfall allows moisture to carry over from the winter into the monsoon and then again into the winter. The soils are largely entosols, mollisols, and inceptisols. With the main change as you move up in elevation is it's a bit deeper to the depth of the paralithic contact on this granitic material, going from about maybe 30 centimeters down to closer to 60 centimeters at the highest elevations. And we also see an increase in the carbon concentration in the profiles, that you can see pretty clearly from these photos. Okay, so June 2020, the Bighorn Fire occurred, and I put in some of these kind of apocalyptic pictures here. If you remember, June 2020 we were in the heart of lockdown. It's the hottest June on record in Tucson, so we had temperatures pushing 115 degrees, and the mountain was on fire. So we joked that all we were missing were the zombies to complete the apocalyptic kind of dystopian future. Right? Again, so the fire burned at varying intensity. I picked out, a photo of a site that was just bombed out here to give you an example of how intense these fires can be. And one of the unique things that we're starting to see in the desert Southwest now is that we're having fire return intervals and fire severity where we're having sites being hit by high severity fires repeatedly, which historically is not the norm. These systems should burn at low intensity fire every 10 to 20 years, burn off the understory and the litter, but now we're seeing these very high intensity fires reoccurring on that same interval. So we have the Catalinas here. I always get distracted in this photo by the San Pedro River and those beautiful early and mid-Pleistocene fans sitting there on the north side. If you're like me, you get into Google Earth and pretty soon you spend an hour looking at images. But so Tucson and sits in the metropolitan area, sits at the base of the Catalinas. And this is the Catalina Mountains here. You can see the vegetation sequence clearly from this image. So one of the unique things is that we had, in the summers of 2002 and 2003, we had the Aspen and Bullock fires, which burned nearly the entire range. And then in that summer of 2020, the Bighorn fire, which was initiated by a lightning strike, dry lightning strike in the early monsoon, ended up burning the entire mountain and going back in and re-burning many of these areas that burned in 2002 and 2003. So we now have this matrix of sites across these different ecosystems where we have well-constrained burn history and burn boundaries of fire severity. So we took advantage of this to basically design a sampling scheme to target these different burn histories and burn severities in each of these different ecosystems. And so this is this whole jumble of letters. This is kind of the combination of factors with the first being the U being for unburned, low being for low, and H being for moderate or high severity. And so we could pair this historical fire history with fire severity. Again, probably right in the center, that low is probably a reference state that would represent kind of the normal soil system. And the most weird or unique would be those that have been hit by high severity and those that have been unburned. Fire is a completely natural part of these systems. Again, some images just to give you an idea. The one on your right is an unburned mixed conifer forest. So clearly looking unburned. And then the site on the left is one that was burned in low severity and then was followed up by a high severity in the 2020 fire. The sampling scheme that we devised is we used these 1,000 square meter plots where essentially within the plots we collected all of the veg survey information with species composition, canopy height, that kind of information. And then around the perimeter, so it's not disturbed within the plot, we collected grab samples and as well as samples for hydraulic properties and bulk density. And so just the things that we collected for, we use mini disc infiltrometers, much easier to carry across rugged terrain and much less water required to use those than a full-size amusometer. And then the grab samples we analyzed for the biogeochemistry, and then the vegetation surveys. We also quantified hydrophobicity with the drop test. So I'm just gonna run through a few example slides, and these are data from 2021, just 1 year post-fire, okay? So the sites they're blocked by the vegetation, the ecosystem types, as well as severity 1 is the early fire and severity 2 is the 2020 fires. So we can see with carbon concentration, we see no impact of fire on those data. What we're seeing is the expected trend of increasing carbon with increasing elevation across these ecosystem types. We're not seeing any impact on pH, which this is when I expected to see a shift in pH with post-fire systems. Where we do start to see some variation is when we're looking at nutrient release post-fire, and it follows severity. So with increasing fire severity, we're seeing increasing concentrations of KCl extractable nitrogen, both nitrate and ammonium. And one of the interesting things is that when we block the data by the 2002-2003 fire, we actually are seeing some of those similar patterns, suggesting there may be a longer-term legacy effect of that previous fire on the soil nutrient status. Where we were expecting to see the big differences by across severity and fire treatments was in the soil hydraulic properties. And you can see we did not see anything, right? So this was surprising to us where the KSAT did not vary by severity across the different ecosystems. There is some patterning within each vegetation unit, but it's not a clear, consistent pattern when the data are grouped. Where we did see a pattern emerge in the soil hydraulic properties was in sorptivity, and surprisingly, when we replotted these data repeatedly to make sure we had the dates correct on which fire severity we're using. We actually see the only significant variation is sorptivity relative to that 2002-2003 fire. Again, suggesting there's this long-lived legacy effect of that previous fire system, which didn't show up post-2020. Okay, and the last graph of data is the hydrophobicity data from the water drop test. We just grouped these as the percentage of points that fell within 3 classes, none to slight to moderate, based on the time of infiltration. And again, the main takeaway is that the only significant pattern we see is that we see the hydrophobicity following the previous fire, the 2002-2003 fire. So this was a bit of a shock to us, where with the higher severity, we're actually seeing less hydrophobicity from that previous fire. So it could be the vegetation response that's come in and changed the carbon quality or carbon chemistry, but we didn't see any hydrophobicity correlation with fire severity in the post-2020 fire. All right, so I think I'm gonna skip this slide and I'll end it here, right? So we've got, basically, looking at this snapshot of data, we're seeing these really complex and somewhat unexpected patterns where there's this legacy fire effect where the fire intensity seems to boost, or we're seeing these clear patterns of increasing fire intensity and increasing nutrient release. But then there's this legacy effect that appears in the soil hydraulic property where that previous fire, that 2002-2003 fire, still seems to be impacting what we're measuring today. So this, I think these data we're hoping then to incorporate in within these ecological site descriptions of expected response. And I think we might have to extend our reference frame to multi-decadal response rather than kind of this less than 5-year kind of response post-fire. So I think that ran out of time.
Okay, that's fine. Thanks very much, Craig. Jim, you're up. Here's my colleague from West Virginia, Jim Thompson, is going to talk about state and transition models.
Do I call it up, or are you
Do
going
we-
to? There it is. All right, good afternoon, everybody. I'll start by acknowledging my co-authors, Travis Nauman and Jim Leonard and Blaine Spellman and Jamin Johansson. Of course, that also forces me to highlight that I'm the last author on this paper. So you're getting the 5th string today. So, but I'll give it my best. All right. So, as David said, that I want to talk a little bit about state and transition models and ecological sites, and particularly how it relates to carbon management. And so our overall premise here is that, that ecological sites and state and transition models provide a useful framework for understanding changes in any dynamic soil property, but specifically we're thinking about carbon in this example. And we know that we are paying attention to carbon not just because of the carbon stocks and understanding the carbon cycle relative to climate change, but how that also influences the water cycle and nutrient cycling and many other ecological functions. And so it's also useful to then note that the methods that we use to develop these state and transition models are inherently sensitive to understanding dynamic soil properties such as soil carbon as it relates to vegetation and erosion, et cetera. So what got particularly Travis and Jim and I thinking along these lines is when we started studying the high elevation red spruce ecosystems in West Virginia. And in the mid-1800s, there were about 200,000 hectares of red spruce forest in West Virginia, in central Appalachia. But it was a highly coveted wood product. And so in the late 1800s, early 1900s, there was significant logging, especially when the railroads came in. And that led to not only the removal of the trees, but then fires. And so today, there's about 10% or about 20,000 hectares of red spruce forest remaining. And so there's a lot of interest in restoring the red spruce ecosystem in central Appalachia. And so this work that Travis was doing when he was at West Virginia, we were mainly looking at the role of soils in understanding restoration, because most of the restoration was being done with looking at elevation alone and climatic factors. But it came to pass that we started paying attention to soil morphology, and that these historic red spruce ecosystems were associated with soils with more spodic morphology. And as a result of that work, that helped lead to the development of some of the first ecological site descriptions in central Appalachia, and that focused on red spruce restoration. And so we can see that this one example, that those soils with more spodic morphology were historically red spruce. Even if they had 0% red spruce on them today, they had that memory of the red spruce forest type. But along that lines, we also started paying attention to soil carbon. And that graph in the lower right here, we can see that as that conifer import, if you had more conifer in the canopy, that it was associated with not just soils with more spodic morphology, but also soils with thicker O horizons. And so with then the advent of the actual development of those ecological site descriptions, some follow-up work by Jim Leonard, we started looking at the carbon stocks within these ecological sites. There are 2 ecological sites associated with the red spruce ecosystem, but also within among the states within these ecological sites. Within soil down to about 1 meter, there's significant difference in the carbon stocks between the spodic ecological sites, the soils that are the ecological sites associated with the true spodosols versus the soils that were spodic intergrades. And so this ecological site, or the state and transition model that I show up here on the upper left, is for that spodic intergrade shale, upland, hardwood, and conifer forests. So these native forests that have a lesser component of spruce in them, that we're able to document that these different ecological states within this ecological site had different carbon stocks, with the reference state having 2 to 3 times as much carbon. These numbers are for the O horizons alone in these systems. And these images at the bottom show examples of these soils as we go from 0% conifer on the left to 30% conifer in the overstory on the right, and how that is associated with that thicker O horizon in these forests. And so just another way of looking at it, so there was significantly more carbon in the spodosol ecological sites than in the spodic intergrade, with most of that carbon in the O horizon. And within the spodic intergrade, again, the reference state had the most carbon, but you can see that these logged and burned states had the lowest carbon stocks. And so even though that logging and burning was 100 years ago, these soils and these ecological sites have not necessarily recovered in terms of their soil morphology, in particular their carbon stocks, but a lot less of that carbon stock within these soils is more frequently in the mineral fraction component of the profile than in the O horizons. And so the take home of that for us is that restoring these red spruce forest types, so planting more red spruce in the understory, releasing red spruce that's already present, can, through that management of using the ecological site descriptions, can lead to increasing the carbon stocks in these ecosystems. And so we thought this was a pretty nice example of how we can use these tools of the ecological sites and the state and transition models to inform these management decisions, and specifically in this case, relative to carbon stocks. And so looking around at some other published work or some of the work that was being done by some of our co-authors, started looking at some other examples. And so this is an example from Alaska in the Copper River Basin. We heard from Nick Jelinski earlier. This is work from one out of his group. And these are gelisols, clay gelisols, and some of the data that they collected demonstrates how, as particularly post-fire, as these stands of black spruce get older, I'll start on the right here, that the soil organic carbon stock in that upper meter tends to increase as that soil recovers, but because of the effects of the O horizons on insulating and the permafrost, that depth to the permafrost also changes over time. And so there's not only the carbon stocks, but also the effects on the permafrost in these environments. And so the concern is then also as that the fire regimes change in these ecosystems, that age of the stands since fire, that there won't be that opportunity for these ecosystems to recover, to build up their O horizons and build up those carbon stocks, and they'll get trapped in these younger stands because of a higher return rate of fire. And then we don't have any data on this. This is where some of the current development work is going in more interior Alaska, where there's even more fire pressure, if you will, on these ecosystems, and how these soils will similarly respond to fire and management as it relates to carbon stocks, is a current question. All right? And so you may say, oh, well, Jim, that's a couple of examples of forests in cold, wet climates. What about dry lands? Do these same patterns or concepts also find use in these dry land environments? And so this is some work from Jamin's graduate research on a more dry land ecosystem in Utah. And you can see some of his results here in terms of organic carbon stocks with perennial grass cover and canopy gaps in that perennial grass. And so again, in that reference, as you approach that reference state, you start to build up more organic carbon in these soils. Versus these alternate states within the state and transition model. Okay. You want another example of a dry land? Mark does. So this is some more recent work from Travis, and in these saline bottoms in this southeastern Utah, And this is much less about fire or vegetation building up carbon, but now it's a matter of wind erosion. And these sites are more susceptible to wind erosion and loss of topsoil, and yes, organic carbon, but also inorganic carbon gets taken away with this erosional loss. And so how that affects carbon cycle and carbon dynamics in these types of ecosystems, and how, again, we can use ecological sites and state and transition models to understand the ramifications of these transitions amongst the ecological states in terms of, again, any dynamic soil property, but in these examples, we're focused more on carbon. And once from there, we can start talking about not just these specific sites, but looking at broader scales. If we can start mapping these ecological sites, and more importantly, the ecological states within these sites, and whether it's, in this case, example, wind erosion susceptibility and the amount of carbon that's lost through wind erosion, we can start making not just more informed management decisions, but be more accurate in our accounting and assessment of the effects of land use change and vegetation dynamics and erosion, et cetera, on these dynamic soil properties. So, and this is my last slide here, and so just some ideas that we wanted to bring out and share relative to these concepts is that, again, these ecological sites and the state and transition models are that useful framework for understanding changes in dynamic soil properties. But they can also extend beyond that, and so some of the things we're interested in pursuing are related to not just soil carbon and below ground carbon, but looking at above ground carbon stocks and how that all ties in together with the total carbon stock of the ecosystem. And also an appreciation for how different ecosystems how responsive they are to management and changes in dynamic soil properties, in terms whether it's relative to wanting to increase carbon stocks, like we might want to do in that red spruce ecosystem, and have targets for restoration that build carbon. But it's also knowing that which ecological states or which ecological sites are less responsive or less sensitive to land use change and changes in carbon stocks. Or which ones are most sensitive to disturbance. It might not be about can we increase carbon stocks, but can we more preferentially protect areas that are going to be susceptible to more carbon losses or other changes in dynamic soil properties. And so I'll stop there, and if there's time, entertain any questions. All right. Catch me later.
Jim's not going anywhere, so you can ask your questions at the poster session, which is coming on up.
I'll be here all week.
There we go. There we go. Thanks, folks. Our next speaker is Meyer Bond from Iowa State University, who's going to be talking about legacy data rescue to take a look at carbon stocks in the Corn Belt.
Thanks, Dr. H. Alrighty, yeah, switching out of the forests and going to the Corn Belt. I was actually out in the Sequoia National Park last week, and to see just how destructive those fires can be is impressive. Usually I'm looking at the ground as a soil scientist, but I had my head up all week, so my neck kind of hurts. So I'm glad to be back on the prairie. But yeah, this is a joint project funded by USDA and NRCS in conjunction with my colleague and boss, Bradley Miller, and also one of my former graduate classmates, Luis Bentancor. So we're focused, we had to define what we considered the Corn Belt, so that's essentially MLRAs with more than 25% coverage of corn and soybean production. So that's where our study sits today. So there was a question yesterday about what legacy data was, so I figured I would do the what, why, and the how, considering legacy data from the what it is. I mean, it's anything that's been collected in the past but needs to be put into a new format so it can be useful. It might be archive data. Sometimes it's called gray literature. But I think all of you, or many of you, know it as all those cabinets in your office. I keep hearing about all these tons of file cabinets that have all these papers. But yeah, we're working with getting those digitized. And why do we want to do this? Well, we want to improve our data sets. And many of you have gone through a lot of painstaking work out in the field to be able to collect this data. I was talking with Gary from southern Georgia, and he made to make sure to put on one of the 232s that the heat index was 110 that day, and he was digging in a wetland, and he wanted to show the mud smudges on the papers and stuff like that. So, you know, we want to rescue this data. It's cost effective. It's way less work to pull out a file than it is to try and get out in the field and take a sample. And then there's just all the natural risks that come with having those things sitting around and not being able to get them into a safer location. And then we also want to be able to utilize them, and I'll talk about that later on, for change detection. So essentially, in order to do this, you need to be able to gather this information, maintain a library, and scan millions and millions, probably billions of documents, and then also give them metadata, so you know where they came from, how to easily find them, access them, query them, make them available online for people, and then also make sure that you have the necessary backup protocols so you don't lose that data. So our objectives for doing this were to develop some kind of protocol for how we were going to digitize, clean up these sheets of paper, how we were going to enter the data, what databases we were going to use, which formats, and also if the currently used databases like NRCS aren't suitable, can we develop something, you know, that can link with it but also has its own intrinsic characteristics. And then on top of that, try to share some training materials to be able to, you know, continue to do this work going forward. And also see if we can find georeferenced legacy data that hasn't been entered into some form of a database. If we can fill gaps in the already sampled locations throughout the United States. So right now we're just working with a pretty big data set that we got from Waverly MLRA 104. That actually it's a lot of lab data from Iowa State. There's over 4,000 records in there that haven't been entered into any form of a database. They're just in PDFs. But it's mostly lab data, so it's not succinct. It's not a complete matchup with the NRCS format. It's more of like, it's mainly its own database, so we're kind of working with how we're going to format that. But you'll typically have some kind of site data sheet with all of the certain information, so these training materials are used to point people in the right direction for what the column name would be in, for this instance, the NRCS database. We haven't focused at all on anything that they've put in terms of soil taxonomy. That gets a little more complicated. And then our biggest thing, that useful information is typically going to be found if it's georeferenced. So we oftentimes have these PLSS details which will show how many feet north and south and east and west of a certain landmark or a corner of the section or the corner of the quarter. And then the rest of the typical site information that's just been translated so people know where to put it. The actual lab data, like I said, kind of has its own format, so we're working on developing our own database for that. And then we also are doing all of the paper documents. We've scanned over 10,000 records at this point, and we're assigning metadata to them, getting them in some kind of accessible database that can be shared. And then also, we're going to be using that to enter data once it's been georeferenced. Georeferencing, there's a few different ways to do it. We've been linking in with one of the BLM products using the sharpshooter package. But basically we can get down to the quarter of the section, putting in the information, and then we just need to get the centroid of the section and then use the rest of the information that's in there. So we've got a few example points here. You can see the green dot is the actual centroid of the quarter of the section. And then from there, we can just shift over based on what the narrative was in the location. And then also try to use some other field identification, things that would inform you on where the sample was probably taken if it's not that accurate. You know, just the soil polygon lines in general are pretty informative because it might help you determine where that sample, where they wanted to take it, where they probably did take it, if their information wasn't super succinct. And then we also have, we're working with another database developed by Adolfo Diaz and Shauna Repking and Terry Shep, where they've been georeferencing and scanning tons of legacy data documents. So we're also accessing that database. So you can see on the left is their legacy PEDON database, 27,000, and then on the right would be the distribution of what is in the NCSS different databases. And these are just carbon-related ones, about 18,000, so that's a good way that we can gap fill and find places where we can fill in information. The change detection part of this, we're still working on the stock portion. Some of the pilot studies that are occurring are going to be actually just looking at topsoil thickness, and that's going to be our stock increment. You know, typically a carbon stock is at some kind of set depth interval, but instead we're going with thickness of molic colors as our stock increment. So we want to be able to create maps from the past with older data, build out time segments, train models, and predict how much carbon we think is there, and then subsequently subtract, figure out how much has changed. So this is the data set for all of the years on the x-axis, and then you can see the count on the y-axis. So there has to be some methodical process for figuring out how you're going to stratify these data out in order to inform a model and make predictions. And there's a lot of work that went into that. Luis primarily worked on this part of the study, but he was able to find a good break at 4 segmentations. So on the top left is from 1951 to 81, then 82 to 98, then 99 to 2008 in the bottom left, and then 2009 to 2018 in the bottom right. And so you can see the trends. The deep purples are thicker topsoil thickness as determined by molic colors. And then the oranges and the yellows would be thinner. So you can see how the contrast between the uplands and the incised valleys starts to become greater over time. If you go from the 50s to the 80s and 90s, you can see that the river valleys get a lot more purple, consequently thicker topsoils. And then that kind of starts to level out present day. So then if we do the subtraction of the current map from the most recent map, and I want to emphasize that this is a statistical prediction. This isn't a process model. We're not using like the century model or anything. This is just prediction for different time intervals. So you can see at 0, where you'd see the white and the grays, not much change. In the greens is where we would have an increase in topsoil, and then the purples is where we would have a decrease. And then I think it was David Lobb that told me like 7 years ago, kind of stuck with me, soil's never like really lost, it's just redistributed. So that's what we're seeing here. And it's kind of hard to see from a statewide perspective, so if we zoom in here to the lower Nishnabotna watershed, this is all lust cap parent material. You can see where all the convex hill slopes are very purple, you know, indicative of denudation, and then also in the valleys, you would have that accumulation, maybe cumulic upbuilding, and those are the green catchments on the foot slopes. So, promising results so far. A lot of work to do in terms of the fact that we are going to extend this out to predict it for soil organic carbon stocks and also across the Corn Belt, but we're headed in the right direction. So I just wanted to acknowledge my co-authors and then a lot of the awesome undergraduate students that have been working hard, doing the hard work on the legacy data, scanning and entry and things of that nature, and then all the NRCS cooperators that have been helping me out and guiding me in the right direction. So, with that, I will take some of your questions.
There's time for a couple questions from the audience.
Do you have any, say, alternative sources of information with which you can use to like validate that model? So you didn't go into all the details of how you generated the model, but we have lots of anecdotal evidence of like fence rows and things like that. Is there any like information readily available that you can use there to confirm your predictions, like with some of those fence row type examples? To like that 70 centimeters, like is that a typical value, or anyway, I think you get my point.
Yeah, so I think you're asking, do we have some information available to actually validate what we're seeing? And all of our validation right now is only coming from the model internally, but we are doing independent validation, so they're never used to train the model, but we have not looked into trying to find any information that would help us validate our current predictions. But that is something that would be a great thing to do, so.
Other questions? Comments? Thank you, Meyer. Our next speaker is Daryl Schultz, who's going to be sharing some of his exciting soil landscape work utilizing our Sorgo data.
Okay, thank you. Oh, do I need to push something, or? There it is. Okay, I'd like to talk about some of the work I've been doing on visualizing soil landscapes by mining the soil survey taxonomic data. And I really don't need to tell this group that the Sorgo database is the most detailed soils database that we have in the U.S. Covers all the 50 states and the territories. There's 318,000 soil map units, over 1.1 million components, over 36 million polygons, and of course this is the culmination of 124 years of soil survey. And throughout that, there's been a close correspondence or interaction between soil mapping and soil taxonomy. And when we classify soils, we observe the soil profile, we write a profile description, we identify soil properties, and then we classify the soil. And at each of those steps, there's very detailed procedures and definitions that we follow, so that in the end, these taxonomic names have quite a lot of embedded information contained in them. So now we can go back to our soil map unit here, which happens to be the home farm that I grew up on, and look at this carbuncle soil. It's a Utic calciestol. And that, of course, that tells us it's a mollisol with a dark surface. It's a nustic moisture regime. It has a calcic horizon, and so on. And that of course, is information that's associated with that polygon. And then we can ask the question, where are all the polygons with dark surface horizons or eustic moisture regimes or calcic horizons? And that's what we've been doing in this project to create maps of soil properties from the Surgo data set. And to do that, we find and flag all the components with the property of interest by parsing the taxonomic names like I've just illustrated. Then we calculate the percentage of the property of interest for each map unit. We place each map unit into an appropriate class, and I've settled on two main groups, 50 to 100% of the area is dominant, and then 10 to 49% is significant but not dominant. Then we select a color scheme, and ideally that should be colorblind safe. And then we create a map at the full resolution of the Surgo data set down to about 1 to 18,000. And this is designed to be multi-scale, and of course it's continental to local. And then those are made available on the Soil Explorer website and the Soil Explorer apps. The easy one is the soil order map, and I won't say much about that one, except that this is probably a lot more detailed than most of the soil order maps that you've seen. But it gets interesting then when you look at different properties, and one of the first properties that I looked at was where are all the soils with clay-enriched subsoils? Taxonomy includes 3 horizons, argillic, natric, and candic horizons, and one property, lamellae, that have alluvial clay enrichment with depth. So to find all of these, we have to develop a list of search terms, and so away we went. So all the alpha sols, and by the time we got done, there were over 125 unique search terms that have clay-enriched subsoils of some kind. Many of these are quite obvious. You can see the RG, alphic, lamellic, candic, and natric. It's pretty obvious, but then there's others, and those are easy to find. But there's others that can kind of sneak up on you. The paley great groups also have thick argillic horizons, and so you have to include those as well. And so here's the resulting map that from that, and you can see that argillic horizons literally are everywhere. Many of you are probably aware that just you live in an area where you can dig a pit, and just about everywhere you find an argillic horizon, and this shows how common they are. Candic horizons, of course, here in the southeastern U.S. Natric horizons up here in the Dakotas and the western states, but if you look carefully, you'll see them along the Gulf Coast and the Mississippi Delta, even some in Illinois. The lamellae are not real obvious on this map, but if you zoom into a place like this, you'll see the lamellae, the sand dunes that have lamellic subgroups. So you can learn a lot about the distribution of these properties from these maps. Another one that I was worked on that I've had for a while for Indiana was dark surface horizons, because in Indiana they correlate fairly well with the historic prairies, and so I've extended that now to the rest of the U.S., and I've pulled in all of the dark surface horizons. Of course, the mollisols is the order we think about, but there are also molic subgroups of many soil orders. There's humic subgroups, there's umbric subgroups, and there's melanic subgroups, and all of these have a dark surface of some kind that's well defined in taxonomy. Now, sometimes, particularly for humic, the definitions vary, so we went into all the definitions and made sure that we pulled out only those search terms that actually had a dark surface, because some of the humic subgroups refer to organic matter integrated over a certain depth. And so this is the map that results. The dark, it's fairly simple. The light, these are the ochric epipetons. And then we pull out the histosols, the organic soils separately, because they are dark, but they're, of course, they're very different from the mineral soils. Now, you can see the sweep of the dark soils from the Texas Gulf Coast all the way up to Canada. And you can also see this excursion of the dark soils into just below the Great Lakes across Iowa, Illinois, and into Indiana and Ohio. And if we zoom in on a bit on that, this is called the Prairie Peninsula. This was first described by Edgar Transeau in 1935. This is Transeau's map. He and his colleagues went into the public land survey system and pulled out all of the prairie soils. It must have been a phenomenal amount of work to do that. But then we can georeference that and compare it to the dark surface from the soil survey. And that's what I've done here. It's overlaid. And you can see that, let's see, on my bills, you can see that there's some areas here that many areas match pretty well, but there's some that don't match that well, particularly this large area here in northeast Missouri. We'll zoom out a bit, and you can see that area on the map. Those of you from Texas may have noticed that the blackland prairies are missing. And I've wondered about that myself, and I'll show you here in a minute. If we overlay the map of the swelling soils, you see that most of these missing areas are swelling soils, either vertisols, the dark blue, or the vertic subgroups, these the sort of teal color there. And it turns out that a dark surface is important in taxonomy unless something else is more important. And that's the case, for example, here with this Mexico soil series, a vertic epiaqualf. And if you go look at the OSD, that does have a dark surface. It's got a good molic epipeton. But in the molic subgroups occur later in the keys, and there are no molic vertic subgroups in the keys. So the fact that this Mexico has a dark surface is not reflected in the taxonomy at all. Now here's the Houston black, the state soil of Texas, Utica haplosterts. The dark surface is not apparent from the classification. And I've kind of wondered about that, but as I put this together, I looked back at taxonomy and I missed it. It's this oops that needs to be fixed. But you have to go deep in the taxonomy and read the definitions. Chromic Utic subgroups key out immediately before Utic, so they pull out the light-colored surfaces, and what's left are the subgroups that have dark surfaces. So this is a mistake that needs to be fixed, and it's one that I was not aware of when I was putting those search terms together initially. So, so much for the dark surfaces. One more example to help inform the discussion of the Aquasol's proposed order. I put together a map of aqueous conditions, and this takes a bit of time to unpack, but what I came up with were all of the terms that refer to wet soils at the suborder, grade group, and subgroup level. So you can classify these in the aqueous, endoaqueous, epiaqueous, histoaqueous, histicaqueous, wasaqueous, and then there are eric subgroups of these. You can, it takes a little bit of time to study these to see where these occur locally. But one thing that mystified me initially when I first put this together, why we have these aqueous up here that are not classified into endoaqueous or epiaqueous. And if you look at all of the aqueous subgroups, the aqueous by themselves have plinthite or fragipans or candic horizons, and only at the end of the keys do terms like epiaqueous and endoaqueous come into play. So the challenges and limitations of doing something like this, there are taxonomic terms from everything from the first version of the key to the 12th version of the key in the Sergo database. So you have to sort through all of those things as taxonomy change. Then you have to work around the quirks in taxonomy. The formative elements are defined differently in different places. For example, the hume or humic can be dark surface or organic matter with depth. The properties are not always apparent from the taxonomic names, as I just illustrated with the eutic and typic haplosterts. And then the hierarchical design of taxonomy sometimes prioritizes something other than the property that you're interested in. And then initially I spent quite a bit of time just settling on these map unit areas, but these classes work pretty well. You can take a look at all of the results of this on Soil Explorer, and I'll have to acknowledge funding by NRCS for this. I invite you to go to soilexplorer.net and check these out for yourself. If you find any things that are wrong, let me know. We've just released a new version of the web version that has active overlays, which is quite handy. Search function, which I've wanted for a long time, help, which is quite useful as well. And eventually we hope to update the apps to have these features as well. So I thank you for, and of course this, also the net version works quite well on cell phones, but I can't make your screen bigger, sorry. So thank you for your attention. If there's time, I'll take a question or two.
We don't have time for questions. Sorry. Thank you, Daryl. Our last speaker of this session is Susan Canast-Brown from Montana, who's going to be talking to us about the SOLAS soil landscapes of the United States. Here we go. Welcome.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and I'm happy to be here to be able to talk to you about soil landscapes of the U.S. On behalf of my awesome team listed here on the slide, which includes Travis Nauman, Dave White, Colby Brungard, Stephen Roker, Jessica Phillip, and Jim Thompson. Several of us are here this week, so feel free to stop and chat with us about this work. So about 5 years ago, the digital soil mapping team was formed, and the sub-team working on this project is a group of soil scientists from federal agencies and universities with a common goal of providing a nationwide continuous soil property stack to modelers, researchers, and decision makers. We were very interested in providing an alternative to existing property maps. We felt we could improve on these efforts with our expertise and by using multiple sources of soil survey data. We were also very interested in making a product that was flexible and easy to update as new data was acquired, new modeling approaches were developed, and user needs evolved over time. So Soil Landscapes of the US is a set of raster-based continuous soil property maps generated for the US using digital soil mapping methods. Phase 1 of the project is 100-meter maps. These maps and an open comment period is complete, and this is what I'm going to focus on today. Phase 2 of the maps will be 30-meter resolution maps. And based on a research methodology project that the team did early on in the process, we decided to predict these properties at point depths rather than over standard depth intervals. The maps also include uncertainty and accuracy metrics, and they follow standards in the National Soil Survey Handbook, Part 648. These standards are very similar to global soil map standards, but are different. We've evolved them for our work. So for the 100-meter maps, we have targeted a standard set of chemical and physical soil properties that have been identified as key for interpreting soils for management and use. You'll see down there at the bottom, we have available water holding capacity on the list, which is, of course, a very important and sought-after soil property. We noticed with the 100-meter work that there were issues in the training data for this property that is likely has to do with inconsistent attribution of the data. So this is something we're going to dig into a little bit further as we continue our work on the 30-meter maps and try to resolve that issue. We fully expect this list of properties to evolve over time as user needs evolve and new properties are needed. So we expect this list to expand over time. So of course, we're doing large-scale work. We're trying to make nationwide property maps. We need a lot of data for this effort, and we're very fortunate here in the US to have decades worth of soil survey data available for our use. For this 100-meter map effort, we used almost 300,000 observations across the US. This was a combination of both lab and field estimated property data. We then supplemented those data with random points generated from GNATSCO, and I'll talk a little bit more about how that worked when I go through the workflow. So, of course, along with our observation data, we need covariates. We borrowed the 100-meter covariates from the work of Ramcharan et al. In 2018. This is a set of about 175 multi-scale covariates that represent multiple soil forming factors, as you can see listed here. This is a crazy looking slide, but I'm going to go through each step and tell you a little bit about what we did in this workflow. So starting in step 1, we tested different tiers of data based on the reliability of the location, information, and source. And we tested these data in a random forest model, and we were looking for the data sets that maximize the accuracy and minimize the uncertainty. The ones that were selected are highlighted in red. So any observations that were later than the year 2000, this seems obvious as we know GPS technology is more reliable after that date. And then also, not surprisingly, KSSL lab data ranked out as a top performer. And then along with that, we had our NASIS pedons that were linked to components, and then also NASIS pedons that were linked to with a spatial link to a home map unit. Then we took that data, moved to step 2, and this is where we selected random points from GNATSCO to fill the gaps in the data that we selected from step 1. Once we had all of that point data together, we move on to step 3, where we build a random forest model using our covariates and all that point data, and we're able to estimate the global relative prediction interval, which is a measure of uncertainty. Then we use that information to choose a spatial cross-validation scale in step 4. So we have always incorporated normal cross-validation into our work, but there have been advances in the research lately, and spatial cross-validation was something that was of interest to test, and so we decided to incorporate that into the work. So what we do is select a spatial block scale for the spatial cross-validation that best matches the global relative prediction interval. So we're trying to get a good match on the uncertainty there. Once that's complete, we can take all of that information to the 5th and final step, and that's where we actually run the random forest model, and we do our normal cross-validation and our spatial cross-validation. We do normal cross-validation on 2 sets of data, just the lab data itself and then all the data combined. We then, the final and most exciting step is to actually see the maps. So final output of the predictions as well as the uncertainty. So let's look at those maps. This is an example of clay content at the 60-centimeter depth. So on the left-hand side, we have the prediction where the darker colors indicate areas of higher clay. In the middle is a point density map, and this is a really cool way where we can visually see where the training data for this particular property in depth came from. Because although we have all of that PEDON data available to us and we've supplemented it with the GNATSCO data, not all of those points have all properties at all depths. So this will vary for each one of our properties and depths. Then on the right-hand side, you can see the uncertainty layer. This is the relative prediction interval, where darker areas have lower uncertainty and brighter areas have higher uncertainty. This is a look at the results for the normal cross-validation for all depths and all properties. The average R-squared was 0.63, so that's for all properties and all depths. And then we see a trend for most properties that the shallower depths have higher R-squared. This is expected as we often are measuring more properties higher up in the profile. So we have more data to work with, which always leads, or almost always leads to more accurate results. Something interesting that we noticed is with the salinity-related properties, that trend was flip-flopped, so that the deeper depths had higher accuracy. We're not quite sure why that's happening, so that's something interesting that we're going to be looking into with the next iteration of the work. So just to look at some things that we noticed as improvements when we compare the SOLAS 100 maps to GNATSCO, we can see with the DSM approach, we're able to harmonize over soil survey areas. We're also able to see that within map unit variability coming out. There are also limitations to this approach. So we noticed in some of these areas, large, broad alluvial areas that, at least at the scale we're working at now with the DSM approach, we're losing a lot of that detail that's present in our SURGO data. So we are making note of these things, and we'll be looking to improve this, hopefully, with future iterations. This is a great example of how including the GNATSCO training data really improved the maps. So I'm going to have you focus in on the Sandhills area. This is somewhere we're all very familiar with that should be very sandy and very little clay. So on the left-hand side, we see the GNATSCO maps with that really prominent signature, high sand, low clay there in the sand hills. In the middle was our first iteration of the SOLAS maps where we did not include the GNATSCO training points, and we see that signature kind of dampen. Of course, we as soil scientists know that should be there, and that's very bothersome. So back to the drawing board and decided to include the GNATSCO points in training, and we see that they really can improve some of those geographic representations that we expect. So, of course, we learn a lot through this work. Let's hope we learn, because otherwise, what's the point? So we did try weighting schemes for our training data. This is something that has been shown useful in the literature. We thought we'd give it a try. It did not improve our results, so we didn't end up incorporating that into our final workflow. We also tried data reduction with our covariates, which is a very standard practice in digital soil mapping. But what we found is that because we were working with these multi-scale covariates, the coarser covariates were predominantly chosen, which of course leads to a loss of information. So that did not work out well for us as well. Of course, we did notice, as I just mentioned, that the inclusion of the GNATSCO training really improved our results, so that's something we'll be keeping in the workflow moving forward. And then following some interesting debate in the literature, we decided to, as I mentioned, we tested the spatial cross-validation and included that with our normal cross-validation. And we ended up keeping both of those and using them to estimate the upper and lower bounds of the map accuracy. So our team recently facilitated a review and open comment period for these 100-meter maps. We did that using Google Cloud Platform and Google Earth Engine. We built apps within Google Earth Engine for each property where people could view the maps, the uncertainty, and then provide feedback to us. This is an example of our app, and this is showing clay percent, where brighter areas have higher clay. Within the app, if you click on a point anywhere in the US, you will get a red dot dropped onto the map, like this one here near Moab, Utah. And once that appears, then you also get to view the charts for the prediction values at that pixel location, as well as the uncertainty at that pixel location. You'll notice here in this area there are some holes in the map. Some of those light areas are where we don't have predictions. The predictions have been screened for our predicted depth to bedrock. So you'll also notice in the charts we don't have a value for the 100 and 150 centimeter depth. You can also view the uncertainty maps. So this is the relative prediction interval maps. Darker areas have lower uncertainty, higher areas are going to be brighter. The relative prediction interval is a ratio of the 95% prediction interval range to the 95% inner quantile range of the training data. The values of the relative prediction interval range from 0 to 1, and if you're within that, of course, lower values mean higher certainty, lower uncertainty. I'm looking at Jess, because she always wants to coin uncertainty as certainty. That sounds so much more positive. So if you are above a value of 1, it means that your predictions are outside the range of the training data. So this is a really easy to interpret expression of uncertainty that we can also visualize spatially. All right, as this work is moving forward, we're going to be focusing on generating 30-meter maps and expanding this work to other areas of the US besides the continental United States. We're also very interested in how we can use a digital soil mapping framework to predict dynamic soil properties. And within the US, or excuse me, within the NRCS, We will be exploring how we can combine these property maps with hydrologic and ecological site data to support dynamic soil survey. We're also very interested in how these maps might be utilized in agency modeling tools, so we're looking forward to testing some of that. Property maps have been shown very useful in environmental assessment and modeling. There's an example on this slide of salinity yields in the upper Colorado River Basin, which used property maps and a digital soil mapping framework to make those assessments. Property maps have also been shown useful in generating raster-based interpretations. And of course, once people have these maps in their hands, we are very excited to see what kind of creative and innovative things people will be doing with them. So there's a lot of discovery ahead, and that's something we're very much looking forward to. So our team did complete work on a raster-based interpretations engine. I think everyone in this room knows that raster interpretations in general are the way that our soils data is used most in the US. This raster-based interpretations engine can take in various types of raster data, some of which would be coming from property maps generated with digital soil mapping. In this case, we had maps available in the upper Colorado River Basin, so we focused in on a county in southeastern Utah. And we focused on generating some of the most popular interpretations from Web Soil Survey. And for this slide, I'm showing hydrologic soil group as well as soil vulnerability index. So the hope is to expand this raster interpretation engine to other interpretations, as well as incorporate our new SOLIS maps. So although this work is focused a lot on data and technology, we still have the primary focus of fundamental pedology and communication of soil knowledge. We are trying to build a framework for annual update of these maps as new data becomes available. There are advances in modeling approaches and user needs expand. We are hoping to foster through that effort an environment of continuous improvement and provide a complete, consistent, correct, comprehensive, and current inventory of the soil resource in the US. Thank you.
I believe, yes, I think if you have questions for Suzanne, I think we'll have to, you'll have to catch her during the next sessions. And now we're about to move over, unless there's announcements.
I'm gonna make some announcements for you all. Okay, so now we're going to move into our poster session, and which means we're gonna relocate over to the Gateway to Science. For those of you that don't know, if you go to page 3 in your program, Gateway to Science pointed out right here to the west of the stadium. The building wasn't there in that photo when that aerial photo was taken, so we're going, it's a brand new building. It's about the same distance from here as your hotel at the Hampton is. Okay? Is there anybody that needs help finding that? The other thing is it's a little wet out there at where we served lunch. There's a box of rain ponchos. Grab one if you want one. There's not one for everybody, but some of you will get to stay dry. Okay, so we'll meet over there. Before you go, hold on. Before you go, the way this poster session is going to work, Beverly has divided the posters into 4 categories. And so each category has a range of posters, and you know your poster number from the abstract list in the program. So group 1 will have, say, posters 1 through 25. If you're not in that group, that first group, follow along and listen to the stump talks. If you are in that group, go stand by your poster. We are going to move through the line of posters with our stopwatch And as we stop at each poster, you'll have 1 minute to introduce yourself and your poster and give us your key talking points. And then we're going to move on to the next one when your minute is up. All right. We'll be meeting over there at 3 o'clock. We're going to start the poster session.